appreciation. At this point in the semester, we are going to kind of switch gears and move into discussions about popular music. So at this point, we're going to be moving outside of the textbook, the Listen to This textbook. So over the course of the next couple weeks, I'll be pulling together some readings. I'll put them link to them on Blackboard or maybe some websites for you to look at, online articles, things like that. But we're going to be going out beyond the textbook from now on to because unfortunately it doesn't really do a great job of covering popular music, and I think it's a topic that really deserves a lot of attention. So today we're going to begin by having a brief introduction to kind of the origins of the pop music industry here in the US, and then we'll start to introduce the concept of rock and roll. I want to start here with this quote that comes from the Oxford Music Encyclopedia, and this is really the definitive encyclopedia for professional musicians. So it's quite important and it's quite widely used by musicians. So I was curious what it had to say about popular music, and so I pulled up the article and it begins with this. Quote, a term widely used to refer to types of music that are considered to be of lower value and complexity than art music, and that are readily accessible to large numbers of musically uneducated listeners rather than the elite, end quote. So this definition definitely surprised me, and I think also is maybe a little bit offensive to some people, I can imagine, because there's a lot of assumptions here, and a lot of kind of subjective judgments happening. So, I'd be curious to see if you agree with this, if you find there's something problematic with it. But I think it is useful in kind of summarizing the way that pop music has been seen relative to classical music for quite a long time. We talk about it, or this article talks about it as being of lower value, lower complexity, so kind of simplistic, lowbrow music, readily accessible to musically uneducated listeners rather than the elite. There's a lot of value judgments being made here. I personally disagree with this. I think popular music is reflective of the culture and our society and what we value and what makes us happy. And so I think popular music is certainly just as important and meaningful as any other type of music. But it's always good to start kind of with the definitions here. So what makes music popular versus classical? When we talk about popular music, of course, to be popular is to be liked by a lot of people. So we can talk about the scale of consumption, its distribution patterns, and also its kind of societal links here. So popular music is popular because a lot of people consume it. And we can measure the sale of popular music through record sales, through ticket sales and audience numbers at live performances, through merchandise sales, through advertisements, ties with corporations, tie-ins with television, how many clicks you get on the internet, how many people watch your YouTube videos or download your songs on iTunes. There are so many different ways to measure the consumption of a given album or a single. We can talk about the ways that this is distributed as well, which ties in a similar concept here. Popular music is distributed on the radio, in television and movies, and more recently, and probably most importantly at this point, is the internet. So again, who's downloading your music, who's watching it on YouTube, who's talking about it, who's following you online, all of those aspects. And of course, popular music is often for many people closely tied in with kind of personal identity. So people often tend to group themselves, be friends with people who listen to similar types of music, sometimes dress in certain types of ways that reflect the types of music that they listen to. And this music is all tied in to kind of form an identity for you, for the mass markets. So I say production by the people. We often see popular artists that we enjoy, we kind of personally identify with them and see them as being one of us who is making the music, rather than thinking of them as being like the elite often, which I think is what this definition here was kind of referring to. Okay, so the pop music industry is a relatively new phenomenon, born in the early 20th century here in the US. So that is yet another one of the important kind of American contributions to the music stage internationally. And we can really say that the origins of the pop music industry begin in Manhattan in the first decade or so of the 20th century. So Tin Pan Alley, and I'll show you this picture quickly, was actually a street in Manhattan, about a whole row or like a whole block of all of these different music publishers. So you can see, if you look at the signs carefully, almost all of these say something about music or publishing. It was very, very important, and it got its name because there were so many people in all of these buildings playing piano and singing that people often said it sounded like just a bunch of people banging around on tin pans as you walked through the street. So it's kind of got its nickname there. And the way that Tin Pan Alley worked, recall it's the early 20th century. This is before radio was available for consumers to have in your home. You could have a phonograph or a gramophone, but those were often quite expensive. So the most common way for people to experience music in their personal time, at this point in time, was to actually play it at home. So you would actually go buy the sheet music from these publishers on Tin Pan Alley, go home, and you would play it yourself on the piano and sing along to it. Often it was like a family entertainment kind of thing, or if your friends came over, you'd all get together and sing music and play it together. And so the way that Tin Pan Alley worked was that they had rows and rows and tons of people all just writing music. Each little kind of office cubicle would have a piano, and you would have a songwriter in there who's just churning out songs continuously all day long. And then you would have people who were called song pluggers here, and they would stand out in the streets and actually just sing the music. And so if you wanted to go buy some music, you could walk down the street here in Tin Pan Alley and listen to the song pluggers singing these songs. You could hear them for yourself and decide whether or not you wanted to buy it. Of course, not long after this, the radio becomes popular, and so people are no longer interested so much in performing music for themselves at home. By the 1930s, you can buy a radio and have it in your home, and you can press a button and music streams from it. It's much easier, of course, this way. So we see the pattern of music distribution shifting at this point in time. In the very early stages of the radio, or the lifetime of the radio for consumers, it was originally used for military purposes, but by the 1930s, by about 1935, I'd say probably half of the US population had a radio in their own home. And very early on, there were only a couple major national radio stations, and they all played pretty much the same music. And this was music that was performed by and marketed to mainstream white artists, or excuse me, white listeners and audiences. And it was marketed to all ages. So I think today we think of artists as making music for different kind of audiences. There are artists who perform music that is marketed towards preteens and marketed towards 20-year-olds and marketed towards older audiences. But at this point in time, pretty much everyone listened to the same thing. You and your grandmother would have had the same kind of musical experience and tastes at that point. Of course, that gets kind of boring after a while. And as the as radio technology improves, we start to see local, regional radio stations kind of specializing in markets and different genres and styles of music that are directed towards a particular audience. So we start to see radio stations that are focused on blues music or on jazz music, or focused on playing music that teenagers would like specifically, with lyrics that talk about teenage life and that have upbeat, danceable melodies. We also see radio stations and then record labels, they begin marketing music also to different We see marketed towards African Americans, marketed towards white people, performed by African Americans or performed by white people. And so we also see kind of like the rise of the segregation of music as well. So one thing that we see, or phenomenon that we see at this point in time, is that a lot of the major record labels start to produce what they call race records. And so here's an example of a cover over here. And that refers to any style of music of any genre that is produced by a Black artist. Here are a couple other examples of these covers as well. Of course, incredibly problematic and disturbing. But at this point in time, we start to, or the record industry starts to track the sale and the radio playtime of music by both Black and white audiences. And so this is the time period when Billboard was first born in the late 1930s. So here's their current website. They're still around. You may already be familiar with sort of the Billboard Top 40 countdown. And this is the industry standard, and it has been since the 1930s, for tracking the sale and downloads and performances and airtime for different music artists. And they track the highest selling artists of every single day, every week, every month, for every genre. Today, it's kind of considered to just be one single mainstream chart, but back by the 1930s and 40s, they were separated by race. So here's a look at it. Always fun to check out Billboard. So returning here, as we see radio stations begin exploring different audiences and specializing in different genres, people around the country for the very first time are being introduced to different styles of music and different artists that they would never have had a chance to experience before. And this inspires a new genre of music that combines all of these different regional, local American styles of music, like rhythm and blues, jazz, ragtime, country music, folk songs, all of those things. And one particularly important radio DJ, his name was Alan Freed, you can see him here. He is actually the person that coined the term rock and roll. And he was one of the first major national figures on radio to play music by African American artists. And he called this style of music rock and roll because it's fun. There's some kind of innuendos there, if you will. And he started to hold rock and roll shows and introduce kind of in the mainstream all of these different new styles of music. So what is rock and roll? For our purposes in this class, to be specific, we're going to refer to this as a style of music that was popular from the early 1950s to the 1960s. So there's a good 10 years, a good decade, where rock and roll was very popular. And that's what everyone was doing. That's what everyone wanted to listen to. The term rock itself, as you can see here, eventually becomes kind of a more all-encompassing style of music. With different subgenres within it. So by the time we hit the 1960s and the Beatles show up and change everything, we kind of drop the roll part of it and just call it rock. So as I mentioned, it encompasses a lot of different styles of music: jazz, swing, country, folk, gospel, all of this. And it was pioneered originally by African American artists. And those three artists that I want to pay attention to for our next lecture on Wednesday would be Fats Domino, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard. But for our purposes today, I just want to introduce this whole concept. The standard instrumentation, of course, as you probably are familiar with, would be guitar, bass, drums, and then a lead singer, of course. Another important aspect, rhythmically speaking, I've laid out the notation here for what's known as a backbeat, which means that you're emphasizing beats 2 and 4. So if you're counting in a 1, 2, 3, 4 pattern, every other beat is heavily accented, normally by the bass or the drums. So as we get into the music for the next lecture, you'll be able to hear examples of this backbeat. So this was just an introduction to kind of the beginnings of the pop music industry and defining rock and roll. So for our next talk, we'll be looking at these three artists that kind of constitute the first generation of rock and roll. All right, thank you for listening.